Part 3 of the nervous system. We've talked about cells, the basic unit of the nervous system, and we've talked about how those cells work together in circuits. Now we're going to talk about behaviors and learning. This refers to circuits that have been used over and over and over again. They get stronger, they get faster, and more efficient. Just a side note here, your brain uses a tremendous amount of energy. It's only 2.5% of your body weight, but it uses 25% of your energy. The brain is incredibly expensive in terms of energy. The other thing is, the brain itself cannot keep glucose stored in it. You need that glucose to make energy, to make those cells function and keep going. So if you need glucose readily available, you've got to take it from your bloodstream, which is why when you have low blood sugar levels, you don't tend to really think right. You get foggy. This information has been used, for instance, by schools to offer lunch programs and now even breakfast programs for kids, because if they don't have enough food, if they don't have enough glucose, blood sugar in their system, their brain isn't going to work right and you're not going to physically be able to learn. Aside just from glucose and energy, vitamins and minerals are incredibly important. In a study on malnourished children, IQ scores increased by 10 points when these children were supplied with vitamins. So even though if you are getting plenty of vitamins, we're talking about malnourished children here. This isn't most people, but how you learn depends a lot on your nutrition levels. Little true and false questions here. Let's see what you say. You're born with a fixed amount of intelligence. Fixed IQ. True or false? False. You are not. Clearly, we just saw that kids with malnutrition have lower IQ scores, not because they're not smart enough, but just because they aren't getting proper nutrition. You can also, it's interesting because the IQ test was invented as a way of checking children's progress in school. If they weren't doing well, then they were supposed to be given extra resources or extra help to allow them to catch up. That's the whole point of the IQ test. Unfortunately, in the world wars, the Army started using IQ tests to assign soldiers to certain jobs, and people started thinking that IQ was something you tested to figure out what you can do in life, rather than seeing what you can do to change. Everyone learns in a particular way. So, for instance, maybe you think you're a visual learner or a verbal learner. What do you think? True or false? Answer: false. If you take one of those tests that says whether you're a visual or a verbal learner, you'll find that almost everyone tests out as a visual learner. The real reason for that is you learn better when you get information in multiple ways. Very few people get visual information without some sort of verbal information. So you're comparing one input versus two. Certainly, if you read about something, see pictures of it, actually do it, you're getting this input in 3 different ways. Of course, you're going to learn better. If you struggle with a concept, it means you're learning. True or false? True. If you're struggling, it doesn't mean that you're bad at something. It means that you are learning. You have to challenge yourself in order to learn something. If it's easy, you're not doing it right. And lastly, it's the teacher's job to make sure I learn. False. It is your job to make sure you learn. I can make things available and I can take the information I have to try to make your job easier. But ultimately, it is your job to make sure that you learn. I can't do it for you. Here are some more myths. The myth of learning styles, visual or verbal learners, we just talked about that. We also talked about in the last unit, or the last part of this lecture, about the myth of the right brain or left brain person. As long as you have that intact corpus callosum, those messages are sent back and forth in nanoseconds. You only use 10% of your brain. If this were true, then our brain would be a lot smaller. Evolution would not allow us to spend 25% of our body's energy when we only use 10% of our brain. Our brain would shrink. Child prodigies are born with certain gifts or talents. I'm sure you guys have heard of the 10-year-old who's performing at Carnegie Hall. Well, that 10-year-old is probably practicing the piano and has been practicing the piano for 40 hours a week since they were big enough to reach the keys. Some people may have certain talents, but it does not mean that you can't be extremely good at anything you choose to do. Yes, there are limitations in life, but for instance, if I wanted to be a professional basketball player, keep in mind, I'm 5 feet tall. If I started when I was 2 years old and practiced in every spare moment of my life, odds are I'd be pretty darn good. I get a lot of students in this class who tell me I just don't get biology. That means you haven't spent enough time, or it's just not important to you. That's fine. But if you really like biology, you can get good at it if you just spend more time and more effort. Time and effort is what makes an expert. IQ, we talked about IQ. Now I want to point out, people are born on a curve. Most people fall in the middle. There are some people who really are born with a potential for a higher IQ, but you're born, let's say, with a potential for your IQ being between here. Let's say between 70 and 130. If you don't do anything and you're not challenging yourself mentally, you can slide down to here. If you are challenging yourself and really putting a lot of effort into it, you can go up. So I'm not saying that there is no genetic component to IQ. What I am saying is that there's tremendous shifts that you can cause just by developing your mind. A lot of people think that a bigger brain means you're smarter. If you were measuring brain size compared to body size, birds would be the winners. Likewise, we also hear that if you have more convolutions in your brain, more of those bumps, it means that you're smarter. The problem with this argument is that makes the bottlenose dolphin the winner. The other problem with this statement is that this little guy, a rat, rats behaviorally demonstrate quite a high level of intelligence, and yet they have absolutely no convolutions. So we don't quite know what makes one species more intelligent than another, but hopefully in the future we'll have a better understanding. How the brain works is that you are born with this huge network of connections in your brain, like this graphic here. And as you develop and as you get experiences, some of those circuits are going to run more and more often, and they're going to get thicker and stronger. And some of those circuits are not going to run very much, if at all, and those will start to wilt away. So you'll end up over time with these heavily trafficked circuits and other circuits that aren't trafficked at all. What you end up with is fewer circuits, but quicker, more efficient, and stronger circuits. That's learning. You have to keep reinforcing those circuits over and over and over again. So when you study, you need to keep challenging yourself and reviewing information multiple times. This is why cramming information the night before is really not an effective approach to learning, because you're running those circuits intensely for one night and then you pretty much forget about it and those circuits start to dwindle back again. In order to keep those circuits, in order to keep what you learn, you have to build them up over time. I've got a link on the Moodle website to a video that shows this, demonstrates this much better than I have here. Learning and forgetting. Here's another piece of information about studying. When you watch this video, if you are paying attention, you will learn the information about 100%. But after about 20 minutes from now, you're going to lose about 40% of this information. You'll forget it. After a day, you'll only remember about a third, and after a week or a month, you'll only remember about a quarter or a fifth of the information you heard here. The real question is, how do you study? What I suggest you do is a day after class, go back and reorganize your notes. What that does is that takes this information here and brings it back up to 100%. The interesting thing about the forgetting curve is it doesn't drop as quickly the second or third or fourth time. So the second time you start to forget again, but it comes down like this. So then, let's say at the end of a week, you go back and you restudy, you're going to bring it back up again. And you're going to forget some. And then before the test, hopefully you will study. And then before the, we don't want to go that far down. And then before the final, you will study again. And hopefully you will know this information pretty well. The reason why I give so many tests about every 2 weeks is because it forces you to keep up with it. Hopefully you don't get to this 31-day period. Not only that, but after 2 weeks, I force you to come back up here, and then at the end of the semester, I force you to come back up again. I use this information in my teaching. We talked a little bit about expertise and talent in the myth section. It's generally figured that you need about 10,000 hours of really intense practice at something to be good at it, really good at it. What's interesting is that breaks down to about 40 hours per week for 5 years. I just think it's interesting that if you're going to go on and get a PhD, you're going to be spending about 40 hours a week for 5 years on one thing. Become an expert in a certain field. The last thing is brain development. You don't stop developing your brain right when you're born or at any point during the fetal development process. Your brain continues to develop ultimately your whole life, but really there are some areas of your brain that don't fully mature until you're in your 20s. These areas are mostly found in the frontal lobe. Those areas are in charge of things like planning. So right now, at your age, you should really be working on things like planning, time management, forcing yourself to initiate activities, especially maybe activities you don't want to do, like studying, or forcing yourself to stop certain activities that you are enjoying to do the responsible thing and maybe get back to work.